Well, before we get started, as we warm up and people trickle in, I just want to let everybody know that the videos have all been edited and put together and are now on YouTube, and you'll be able to find them on mythosophia.net by the end of this session. So check that out and check out all the other myth salons. Everything else is posted, including Romancing the Shadow with Connie Zweig. So before we get started and as we get started, I'll just try to make sure to keep everybody posted on the follow-up on the content that's getting posted so you can keep up with that.
Good morning. My name is Dana White. I am here to host the talks of Lionel Corbett. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Gard Jamieson, my friend and colleague, Dr. Will Lin, and I would welcome you today for our third talk in the series, Fundamentalism and its Relationship to Terrorism. I welcome Dr. Lionel Corbett.
Thank you very much, Dana, and good morning. What I'd like to do is begin with a short description of the characteristics of fundamentalism, the psychological characteristics that predispose to terrorism. Say a little bit for the sake of several psychotherapists who I know might be listening about a few of the problems when you do therapy with fundamentalists, and then move to a discussion of some psychological aspects of terrorism. So let me begin with some of the characteristics of fundamentalism. All the Abrahamic traditions have fundamentalist wings to them, and they have some things in common. They all believe that theirs is the only true religion, or the only path to salvation, or something like that. They typically believe that they have special knowledge of the divine intentions because they have sacred texts that are infallible and they're in divine revelations. And at the extreme, they take a sacred text, such as the Bible, and they say that it has priority over even scientific matters like evolution or the age of the earth. And this is because they think they have special access to sacred knowledge. And this gives them a sense of self-righteousness and sometimes a sense of superiority, actually. And this can happen to the extent that members of other faiths or even more liberal people within their own faith are either devalued or sometimes even demonized. There are many fundamentalists believe that they have a tradition that should adhere to its original founding principles. And any time there's any kind of deviation from the original purity, something has gone wrong. So they often reject modernity. They don't like the moral relativism of modernity. They don't like modernity's tolerance of alternative lifestyles. They tend to have a rather punitive, sometimes sadistic image of God, and they're very concerned with religious purity, the control of thought and behavior, especially usually sexual and aggressive behavior and thoughts as well. This pursuit of purity is often a struggle actually with one's own internal badness or bad feelings. And sometimes fundamentalists are trying to get rid of internal badness through their ritual processes. But the problem from our point of view today is that if this internal sense of badness or impurity is projected onto other people, then these other people might be killed, so that they deal with their badness in projection externally rather than internally. Now, I've met some Christian fundamentalists who have a genuine fear that people who don't believe will suffer eternal punishment. So for them, evangelizing is thought to be socially crucial and important. That's one group. So they go out into the community. There are other fundamentalists, for example, ultra-Orthodox Jews who have the opposite position. They like to remain insular and isolated from mainstream society to remain pure. One of the conflicts that I've seen among Christian fundamentalists is a conflict between belief in a God whom on the one hand they say is loving and forgiving, but on the other hand, if they misbehave, this God is angry and punitive, and this causes them a great deal of tension. Interestingly, fundamentalists of all types are often dangerously militaristic. They're very willing to impose their own rules and structures of law and behavior onto other people. And there's a well-known relationship between fundamentalism and violence. And this gets very toxic when the fundamentalist point of view becomes intertwined with politics. One of the interesting paradoxes about fundamentalists is that although they're very often very pious and they want to save souls, many of them are also very interested in territory and the acquisition of money and power. Their leaders in particular are interested in wealth and power. So we find that a lot of fundamentalists are very expert at fundraising and marketing and social media and advertising and that kind of stuff. Okay, so what are the sources of this kind of fundamentalism psychologically? Well, that one traditional answer is that fundamentalism is a reaction to globalization, to science, the rise of feminism, the decline of religious belief. Those are typical responses. But I think those kind of external factors don't take into account the inner world of the fundamentalists, the psychologists, the psychology of the fundamentalists. These are people who don't like uncertainty. They don't like complexity in their understanding of their religion or of the world. They like to have a clear set of beliefs because then they can soothe very important anxieties like death anxiety and so on. And so what they do is they oversimplify very complex situations into simple binary oppositions like good and evil. And what that does for them is it creates order out of chaos. It reduces uncertainty. And it allows for a very predictable worldview that's free of doubt. And so because of this mental mechanism of splitting into good and evil, all good and all bad, they feel a sense of mastery and clarity. Instead of feeling powerless or confused, they have a very clear idea of what's right and wrong. And many of them, as part of this splitting process, will devalue the present situation of the world and hope for a glorious messianic future when everything will be put to right. Now, because they need certainty and clarity, they typically reject any approach to their sacred text that's metaphorical or symbolic or allegorical. They typically insist on the literal meaning of the text, and they only allow an interpretation of the text from a doctrinal point of view. So they won't take a religious symbol symbolically or metaphorically. They want to take the symbol literally and freeze its meaning. They want truth to be single. They don't like questioning of their beliefs. And sometimes this leads to a kind of hatred of non-believers, and that sometimes leads to violence, which can feed into terrorism in the extreme. Why do they have this antipathy to non-believers? Because if you listen to criticism of their religion or doubt, the doubt of unbelievers, this stirs up any latent doubt of the fundamentalist. So they project their own doubt onto non-believers. Also, projection's a very common dynamic among fundamentalists. If you have internalized toxic figures from childhood, what are called toxic internal objects, harsh parental figures and so on, these can also be projected onto unbelievers. And this helps to account for this obsession that they have with purity. Any sense of personal badness, instead of being felt, is evacuated onto non-believers and then fought out there rather than within the self. This is an important dynamic. So fundamentalism has a very seductive quality if you're looking for straightforward answers. It's also useful for people who want to belong to a group who have similar views that they do. And it's very helpful for people who have what we call an external locus of control. This means that they feel that their lives are controlled by external factors that they have no influence, no control over. They're very often hungry for someone to idealize. That means they're looking for someone who give them a sense of goals and values and a direction in life because they can't find those things in themselves. So because of that, they tend to be attracted to charismatic leaders and to groups that demand allegiance and sacrifice and loyalty, all for the sake of an ideal that they can live up to, that will give them a sense of direction and meaning in life. Now, fundamentalists have built their life on a narrow religious structure and a narrow system of beliefs. Sometimes they've internalized this system from childhood. So they've been heavily conditioned to believe the teachings of their tradition. If they've had a childhood which has led to a very fragile personality, a fragile sense of self, they don't have what we call internal psychological structures, like the ability to control anxiety, or the ability to control impulses, or the ability to develop a sense of direction in life. These are very common problems among people with a fragile personality, with a fragile sense of self. And then what happens to fundamentalists is that the structures of the tradition, what the book says, substitutes for these missing internal structures. So if you have a fragile sense of self, you rigidly adhere to external beliefs and ideas and practices, and that helps you maintain the cohesion of your personality. It helps to control anxiety if you know exactly what to do because the book or the teacher tells you what to do. You can fall back on an external set of rules and regulations like the ones in the sacred texts and the huge theological superstructure that's built on the sacred text. Also, belonging to a group of people who share your beliefs and mirror your values, reflect back to you your values and tell you that they're important and that you're valuable because you have those beliefs. This belonging is very sustaining to one's sense of self. It acts like glue to hold oneself together. Many of these people need to belong to a group because they have what are called twinship needs, or sometimes called alter ego needs, which is the need to feel that I'm like other people. I'm not an alien who's alone. I like to have people around me who are the same as me. So if you belong to a fundamentalist group, you're surrounded by people who are like you. And that also is very strengthening to the sense of self. You feel contained within the group. It's like a protective shell. Unfortunately, of course, the shell becomes a straitjacket. But all this is a way of compensating for internal fragility. Now, if you do have these missing internal self-structures, pardon me, the difficulty controlling anxiety and so on, it's wonderful to have a pre-existing system of meaning, like a religious or a political system that you can adhere to. And it doesn't matter what the system's content is. You find intense fanatical belief among religious ideologues, political ideologues, and these kind of beliefs are used to hold oneself together, to stimulate oneself. They become like an addiction. The beliefs become like an addiction, which ward off deadness or ward off emptiness if you have a fragile sense of self. So that's one of the reasons that it's hard to deal with fundamentalism. The fundamentalist beliefs have these very important psychological functions. Now, the psychoanalysts will dismiss the fundamentalist religious beliefs as illusions based on a wish, That was Freud's classical view. Jungians more typically see fundamentalism as the result of possession by some kind of archetypal image, like the archetype of the apocalypse or something like this. We saw that very clearly in the case of ISIS, which subscribes to a medieval form of Islam that believes in a day of judgment. I'll come back to that, but typically the ISIS members will read their sacred text very literally, and that's why they've revived ancient traditions like slavery and so on. And just like the psychology is the same as among Christian fundamentalists, the ISIS commitment was to bring about the apocalypse. And this is a very typical example of the way in which fundamentalists will adhere literally and rigidly to what is really a mythic image with no modification by ego or by thinking. That's what I mean when I say they've frozen the symbol. Fundamentalists also are very tribal. They like to divide humanity into us and them, our goodness versus their evil. That's another example of a kind of a primitive splitting phenomenon. We are the saved or the chosen ones. You are the ones which will be damned. This kind of primitive splitting is a defense. It shields the individual against any kind of uncertainty, especially all the uncertainties of modern culture. The problem with it is that it radically separates fundamentalists from other people, leading to the development of separate schools, separate communities, all for the sake of safety from a godless world, no television, that kind of thing. So I think this a very high level of anxiety, which is projected onto the modern world, accounts for the fundamentalist preoccupation with apocalyptic imagery, the end times and so on, the sense that we're approaching the eschaton, the notion that the world events will come to a climactic war of good and evil. This archetypal image of a final day of judgment is found in all three of the Abrahamic faiths. So what we've seen is that fundamentalism brings a sense of certainty, and this simplifies some aspects of life because we have, the tradition will give you preformed answers. Instead of having to think about life's difficult questions and quandaries, you go to the book or you go to your spiritual teacher and you have a preformed answer. It's very it simplifies everything. Of course, they pay a tremendous price for this illusion of certainty. They lose individual decision-making. They lose the ability to express their spirituality in a personal way. They have a very narrow view of life. They have a very restricted imagination. And they also, I find, they oversimplify their approach to human nature, and they oversimplify human relationships. And in particular, they don't trust spontaneously occurring religious experience if it doesn't coincide with what they've been told to believe, if it doesn't conform to orthodoxy. In fact, if they can have a very authentic religious experience, but they'll consider a numinous experience, but they'll consider it to be demonic if it's not traditional. So what they're trying to do is maintain what we call cognitive simplicity. And this is a way of defending against very powerful drives like sexuality and aggression and painful affect states. It helps the individual cope with painful affect states. And so what happens is that normal sexual feelings, normal aggression or anger become sources of guilt and shame. And if they have any tendency to low self-esteem because of developmental difficulties in their family of origin, they have tortured feelings of being sinful and bad because of ordinary feelings of sexuality and aggression. And this makes them see human nature as fatally flawed and in need of redemption that can only be achieved through the rituals and the prayers and the sacraments of their particular tradition. Otherwise, we're all condemned. And many of them, in an attempt to control their own impulses, will try to control other people. They try to control other people as a way to vicariously control their own impulses. In the process, they split off personal shadow material. They project it either onto non-believers or onto the devil or the Antichrist, and so on. And these splitting and projective defenses are very tenacious, and because they're protecting a vulnerable sense of self. I've met a few fundamentalists who have a tremendous sense of superiority because they think that they have special rituals and prayers that are what are called apotropaic mechanisms. That's a word that means they ward off evil. They bind anxiety and they protect him from the devil in a way that other people are not protected. But some of them are actually plagued by anxiety about the devil, or a fear of going to hell, or a fear of divine punishment. They have quite severe anxiety about this sometimes. And I've never been quite sure whether anxious people are particularly drawn to fundamentalism to cope with their anxiety, or whether fundamentalist teachings just induce anxiety in predisposed people. But I have found that they're very preoccupied with shame and guilt as they struggle with their sexual and aggressive feelings, or because they feel they're not living up to the moral standards of their tradition. I've met a few fundamentalists who are actually very hopeful, and they say they're hopeful because they have this eschatological hope for the future, but they have to believe that they're good enough to participate in it. Now, another very interesting characteristic of fundamentalists is that they almost uniformly, they see men and women as unequal. They prevent women having political power, and they often will control or prevent the education of women to the same level as men. This is true in secular matters as well as preventing them studying sacred texts. Most fundamentalist societies will try to tightly control women's sexuality. Why? Because the control of women, I think, occurs because sexual desire reveals an area of weakness in men. Sexual desire gives women power and threatens omnipotent defenses, which they need, as I mentioned before, they need to hold themselves together. So they're controlling women to prevent their own shame at their need for women and at their sexual feelings. And of course, almost all of them can't tolerate homophobia, and they will use their religious texts to justify their homophobic behavior. Actually, it's really a personal anxiety of their own that they're using the sacred text to justify. And you see things like the biblical injunction that tells women to submit to their husbands. I think that's in Ephesians 5, perhaps. And they use that kind of text to rationalize misogyny and even to rationalize sadistic behavior. I found that a lot of fundamentalists have a history of trauma. And I found that some of their born-again experiences are actually an attempt at healing early trauma. And the fundamentalists who were traumatized in childhood are very drawn to mythologies like this end times mythology, which anticipate a final destructive battle between good and evil. They get a lot of consolation from this kind of mythic imagery of the end times, looking forward to the advent of the Messiah or a day of judgment, because then all wrongs will be righted and everything that they've unfairly suffered will be compensated for. So this is very attractive mythology. Now, when you're raised in a fundamentalist culture or family, you often have a very strained and authoritarian and somewhat suspicious outlook on the world. Religious fundamentalists tend to be, by and large, politically conservative. They tend to be authoritarian, and many of them are actually anti-democratic. Many suicide bombers show personality traits characteristic of what's called the authoritarian personality. Excuse me. The authoritarian personality is somebody who shows a rigid adherence to conventional values, submission to authority, typically, a lot of aggression, the projection of their own difficulties onto an outgroup, which they feel justified in attacking, sometimes in a terrorist way. They're very concerned with strength, and they devalue any kind of introspection. They're not interested in the inner life or the inner world. And a lot of Middle Eastern terrorists seem to be raised in fundamentalist groups that foster these kind of attitudes. Religious martyrdom is often a feature of fundamentalism, and that kind of martyrdom can be sometimes a fundamentalist protest against liberal democracy and modernism and so on. By the way, a lot of these groups object to the term suicide bombers because in their own mind, they're not committing suicide. They're blowing themselves up for religious reasons. So they're not suicidal, they're not depressed. So they would maybe just prefer to be called human bombers because they don't think they're committing suicide. Now, just for the sake of the therapists who are watching this, let me say a little bit about psychotherapy with fundamentalists, which I found can be very difficult for several reasons. First of all, many of them have been raised to mistrust psychotherapy and psychology in general because it may threaten their belief system. There's concern that if they go to a therapist, that the therapy will lead them away from their religion. Years ago, the fundamentalists used to complain that the classical Freudians would tell them that their whole religion was just infantile dependency. Or it was analogous to an obsessional state, which Freud said this hurt them very much and turned a lot of them against psychotherapy. I've met Orthodox Jewish fundamentalists who were told by psychoanalysts that circumcision is actually a sublimated form of castration. Of course, that is hurtful to them. And religious mysticism in general is often reduced by psychoanalysts to a kind of infantile wish to return to the womb. And that's painful to people who spend their life in monasteries and that kind of setting. So for all these reasons, there's a lot of suspicion of psychology. I've met Christians who've complained that they've been told by psychologists that their theology glorifies suffering. Because of the crucifixion imagery, that their religion perpetuates the oppression of women. Their God image is their God image is a bloodthirsty child abuser. So that for that kind of reason, fundamentalists who are in emotional distress will usually turn to their own clergy before they'll seek psychotherapy. They won't seek psychotherapy unless it's a last resort. And if they do seek psychotherapy, they prefer to see a therapist who belongs to their own tradition. Now, what I found is that when they see their problem, like depression or something like that, from a religious point of view, it's difficult to convince them that this is not a divine punishment. They tend to see painful affect states as punishments because there's so much biblical imagery about punishment for disobedience and sin and so on. So whenever they suffer, they automatically assume they're being punished. Some of them have told me that if I'm depressed like this, God must have abandoned me. And they talk about the hidden God and so on, or my depression is a test of my faith, or it's a sign of my lack of faith. So in other words, as well as struggling with the depression, they're struggling with all this religious superstructure on top of the problem. And that I found considerably complicates psychotherapy. For example, I've met Christian fundamentalists who were raised by very critical, harsh parents who induced a great deal of guilt and shame in them. And that makes these people very receptive to the insistence that human beings are intrinsically or basically sinful. So they have a very punitive conscience, punitive superego, and they're convinced that they're intrinsically bad people. And it's quite hard to soften those attitudes in psychotherapy when they represent these deeply ingrained identifications with parental attitudes or church attitudes. Another thing that's a struggle is that these fundamentalists can have very fixed ideas about gender roles, about what men and women are allowed to do, or belief in creationism and so on. And they get angry with the therapist if the therapist doesn't believe in creationism and so on. So these things will complicate psychotherapy. Sometimes they've come across fundamentalist clergy who encourage very harmful corporal punishment of children on biblical grounds. And I've met a lot of fundamentalists who went to very strict parochial schools where they were made to feel guilt and shame over very minor peccadillos or normal sexual behavior. And when one hears all this as a therapist, I found that there's a tendency for the therapist countertransference to over-pathologize fundamentalists without realizing that most of this is very heavy acculturation. So I've found it sometimes difficult to know whether I'm dealing with religiously motivated asceticism or somebody who's just a masochistic character disorder. They can overlap or be difficult to disentangle. So I found that it requires a lot of tact to work therapeutically with fundamentalists without prematurely challenging his or her belief system, without challenging his sense of identity or challenging his loyalty to the family or to the tribal group. I found one or two people who just cannot tolerate that kind of discussion. And if you're using an ingrained belief system to sustain your sense of self, to maintain hope, to cope with anxiety, you have to be extremely tactful when you talk about religious belief, and you have to wait until there's a trusting therapeutic relationship. Otherwise, you get a lot of premature termination or shame or something like that. And I've met people who left their fundamentalist religion many years ago, many years before entering psychotherapy, excuse me, but they have this residual traces of the early conditioning which still plague them and persist, especially with regard to sexuality and the proneness to guilt and shame. That I found can remain problematic for a long time. So recovery from fundamentalism can be difficult and prolonged, and it can lead to a syndrome that I think therapists should know about called the shattered faith syndrome. And that produces depression, isolation because of estrangement from the family and the church that they left, sometimes loss of a sense of direction in life and a great deal of self-doubt. And I found that many fundamentalists become very skeptical about all belief systems. They hate any kind of organized group that requires commitment because they've been so badly burned. So the therapist has to support the individual search for alternative sources of meaning, or sometimes a more liberal religious tradition. Okay, so let me now move to the issue of how all this plays into terrorism. And by terrorism, I just have the usual way of thinking about this. I mean the use of violence against civilians to achieve political or ideological or religious goals or purposes. This is not a new phenomenon. It goes back to antiquity. It's very well known. The terrorists will plan operations to shock and to impress and to intimidate. It's always been this way. So they want to get they want to produce enough violence to get the attention of the public, of the government, of the media, and so on. And they want to make the target population feel very unsafe and create a sense of vulnerability. Basically, the terrorist act will give the group a sense of power that's disproportionate to their actual political or economic influence. That's one of the reasons they use terrorist tactics. Typically, they claim that peaceful approaches to political change have been ineffective, although I've been told by political experts that they often have not exhausted non-violent approaches before they become violent. And sometimes they're not really interested in peaceful approaches. There's something about their psychology that wants violence that I'm going to get to. What I'm very interested in is, how are these people? Normally, we have a built-in inhibition against harming other people. We don't like to harm, especially people that we don't know or that are innocent. How do they overcome these normal human inhibitions about inflicting harm on innocent people? How are they able to morally justify blowing up people on buses and things like that? So what I'm interested in is, it's obvious that there are historical and social and religious sources of terrorism, but I'm interested in how those sources will interact or become integrated with the terrorist psychological processes. I should parenthetically mention here that, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's the target of the terrorist group that designates the group as a terrorist group. If the people whose interests the terrorists are representing will see the group as heroic. There are many examples of that. When India was struggling for its independence from Britain, the Indian leaders were called terrorists by the British. They were called glorious martyrs by the Indians. Hamas is viewed as evil by the Israelis, but they're supported by many Palestinians. Yesterday's terrorists become today's hero. Menachem Begin was quite violent in his struggle against the British. Later, he was revered by the Israelis. Yasser Arafat was the leader of the PLO, which the Israelis considered to be a terrorist organization, but he was regarded as a freedom fighter by Palestinians, and so on. So much of this designation is a matter of one's point of view, but there still remains the psychological issue of how they can do what they do. Now, part of the problem here is that there's a very wide range of different types of terrorist groups. Social revolutionary groups, religious groups, separatist groups, and so on. The religious groups will see non-believers as evil, and they will usually attack people who don't share their faith. But some religious groups also have political goals. So, for example, radical Islamic terrorists would like to expel Western influence from Muslim countries, which is a political as well as a religious goal. Now, one of the difficulties that we have in this area is that most terrorists are not interviewed by psychologically or certainly depth psychologically oriented researchers. So it's hard to know what their inner world is like. There are quite a few lengthy ideological manifestos and communiques, but I found that when I read them, that there's not much about the terrorists' inner life, their private thoughts and feelings. That mostly this stuff is about their ideology. And that's true of memoirs by Begin and people like that. It's descriptions of the causes and so on. So we don't know much from that material about their inner life. Some of them have obvious reasons for being terrorists. They're not particularly psychological. The state has failed them. The state has persecuted them. They're avenging the death of loved ones. They're fighting for their community, ethnic conflict, and so on. But of course, all these people have an unconscious, okay? So we could say that bin Laden wanted to get American soldiers out of Saudi Arabia, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have unconscious factors playing a part in his behavior. So what would these unconscious factors be, as well as the social and political and religious and historical sources? I don't want to forget those. We have some information from captured terrorists, and we have a lot of theoretical speculation. Many of them have been brought up in communities where hatred of the target group was instilled in them from childhood. And so you have to think not only in terms of the individual, but also in terms of the group or the social psychology of these people. Because a lot of them feel religious sanction for their behavior. And the group is very important. The individual's personality fuses with the identity of the group. Very many of them lose their individual identity. It's as if there's a group self, and the goals of the individual and the goals of the terrorist group becomes the same. There's huge pressure to conform to the group. And any member of the group that will express any doubt will be punished or expelled. So we have to take into account social and group psychology as well as intrapsychic material. Okay. So again, to go back to the problem, how is it that a human being can mercilessly kill an innocent civilian who has no responsibility for the terrorist complaints? How can they ignore ordinary moral constraints? How can they murder people in markets and buses and so on? How do they override our normal sanctions against that kind of thing? Well, one thing they do is they morally restructure the importance of killing. For example, they say, my victims were ruthless oppressors. I'm fighting an evil ideology, and that justifies me in killing them. They also will sanitize their language. So they'll use phrases like, the military does this too, they'll use phrases like collateral damage to describe killing civilians. Or they'll say, my opponent's behavior is even worse than mine. My own behavior is not as bad as the people I'm killing. So they will morally justify themselves and favorably compare their own behavior to the people that they're killing. Or some of them will displace responsibility onto authorities. I'm not responsible. It's the authorities that are telling me what to do. This was the rationale of the Nazi defendants at Nuremberg. We were just following orders. Although at that time it was decided that obedience to inhuman orders doesn't in fact relieve the individual of personal responsibility. Another thing that happens in big groups is that the division of labor diffuses responsibility so that each individual is only doing a very small task, and they only have to pay attention to their own work, and they don't often focus on the larger goal. And then they don't see the results firsthand, especially when they're using a weapon that works remotely. And of course, if you can dehumanize your victim, then it's easier to mistreat them. And you can persuade yourself that my antagonist is forcing me to behave like this. Another very important mechanism is self-deception. This is a difficult area to go into, but we can deceive ourselves. How is that possible? How can a person simultaneously be the one who's doing the deceiving and the one who is being deceived? How can we believe something in the face of evidence to the contrary? If you lie to yourself, who's lying to who exactly? How can your emotions override your rationality? Well, apparently what happens is we use a mechanism of intrapsychic splitting. So part of the self is unconscious of what the other part of the self is doing, so that we kind of know and not know what we're doing at the same time. This is a well-known psychological defense. It's called compartmentalization. It's like there are two parts of you living side by side with a wall in between. You could call it splitting or disavowal or something like that. But all this will allow you to deceive yourself about the horror of what you're actually doing. And then part of you will ignore what the other part of you is doing. And then you can avoid looking at your shadow material, your greed, your envy, your rage, that kind of stuff. And so you can lie to yourself. So self-deception is a very important source of evil. And of course, it contributes to all kinds of prejudice and religious and national and ethnic superiority. It allows holy war and slavery and racism and so on. And of course, if you're psychopathic or narcissistic, then you feel that the rules don't apply to me, and that allows all kinds of evil behavior. Now, so this raises the question, are all terrorists pathological personalities? Are they all psychopathic or malignant narcissists? Well, there are schools of thoughts about this. That there have been some studies of terrorists who say they're not particularly mentally ill. They're not very different than the rest of us. What they're suffering from is bitterness and the need for revenge. They've been humiliated. They've been frustrated by an occupying power. They have a low standard of living compared to, say, Western societies. They feel oppressed by dictators who they see as puppets of the West. They want to, it's better to feel strong and hateful and resist rather than feeling powerless and weak. And of course, if you grow up in that kind of society where you've been oppressed for a long time, you're very vulnerable to extremist preachers who can focus their rage by invoking jihadist ideology and radical interpretations of the Quran and so on. And if you're a young person looking for someone to idealize, looking for someone to put on a pedestal and give you a sense of direction, then you're very attracted to charismatic individuals and idealistic causes and so on. And that helps you cope with the pain of your poverty and your low status if you can act instead of feeling helpless, instead of feeling just oppressed. If you can act, you feel better about yourself rather than feeling weak. So some people say, given all that, these people are not particularly abnormal. It always seems to me, however, that I think they must be suffering from some kind of psychological issues. Otherwise, they couldn't carry out the mass murder of civilians. So I think, based on the people that I've seen and what I've read in the literature in this area, that these are often people who were quite badly traumatized and abused in childhood. That they are people who grow up mistrusting others, hating the feeling that they're passive, dreading any violations of boundaries, that kind of thing. So what they do is they turn passive into active. Instead of being a victim as they were in childhood, when they grew up in violent cultures where they were victimized, they victimize other people. By devaluing other people, they support their own self-esteem, and they suppress their moral feelings, and they justify antisocial behavior and cruelty. They've often been raised to see the world as bad and dangerous because of childhood deprivation and privation, so they're often paranoid. And they rationalize their tendency to violence with political explanations. So they're drawn to terrorist groups by economic deprivation, loss of territory, loss of civil liberties, and so on. And all these factors will mobilize narcissistic rage, which is rage that wants revenge when the self has been hurt. And that will help them lead them to joining a terror group. And then any sense of weakness or passivity is split off and projected onto an outside group. And as I said before, the group sustains any vulnerable members inside it. If you're with a group of like-minded people, you feel supported. It's very helpful. You're part of a group self. And if you have a charismatic leader, you've got someone to admire, and you're supported by the group members who accept you and value you, your ideology sustains you, and so on. And all these factors will contribute to your to the cohesion of your sense of self and give you a sense that you belong. So if you have had a traumatic childhood and you have internal emptiness or you feel isolated, the group will give you the structure and the support that you need. And if you've been humiliated in childhood, then violent action will allow you to express revenge and hatred and give you a sense of importance. And of course, being part of a terrorist group is exciting. You can display courage. You can have a sense of power and that kind of stuff. So I don't think politics and religion alone will account for terrorism. For example, it wouldn't account for the way they treat women. It wouldn't account for why they want to enforce their theology onto other people. They must be suffering from, I think, from a complete lack of empathy. I don't think that would be the result of political injustice alone. I think they must be people who've had infantile neglect and abuse. And I think they have a great deal of hostility and repressed fear, especially fear of women. I think they brutalize and demean women to overcome their own pathological rage and anxiety. Most of the people who despise women are terrified of women, and they're getting vengeance. They are sometimes displacing onto women the rage they felt towards mothers or other women early in their life who neglected them, and so on. So misogyny is very common among these terrorist groups, partly due to social indoctrination that devalues anything feminine. Any kind of male weakness in these groups or any kind of emotional need is equated with a kind of emasculated effeminacy. So that misogyny in terrorist groups represents men's dread of helplessness and neediness that's displaced onto women. I don't know whether you would like me to go on or stop at this point and have a discussion. How do you feel about that, Dana? I was going to talk a little bit about the psychology of terrorist leaders, but
I have
we could. Yeah.
I think that this really does tie into the talk that we had at the last Myth Salon with Connie Zweig, who has actually come forth, and I'm going to open up her mic, and let's see if we can talk about the shadow side of what comes forth and why somebody would be motivated to do acts of terror, and why they would become a fundamentalist. What part of the psyche?
Well, that's what I've just been trying to. That's what I've just been trying to explain.
Right.
That was my initial question.
I think, yes, Lionel did a fabulous job of that. I think it's about the split off shadow part. So I'm using the word shadow, but you know, Lionel described compartmentalization and splitting and all the defenses where the shadow material, how the shadow material gets repressed, and then it gets projected onto the other who becomes the enemy. There is, I'm so glad you unmuted me because I was thinking of emailing Lionel about this. I think there's another dimension, Lionel, which I wrote about in Meeting the Shadow of Spirituality. The original title of that book was The Holy Longing. And I think that there is a valid, and I would even almost say universal, yearning in the human soul for transcendence, for evolution.
Yeah.
And that what happens with fundamentalism is it gets concretized as yearning for the other world, for heaven, for the garden, for
Yes.
salvation, you know, for sitting at the hand of God, or for Islam in the garden. And that yearning or holy longing, which Goethe called it, fuels. It's totally, it's unconscious. I mean, it's in the dogma. So in some ways it's conscious. That's why they reject the word suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not killing themselves. They're going to be sitting at the hand of God.
Yeah, no, I completely agree about the holy longing. I think it's very important, but I'm not sure that explains why they will be willing to blow up other people.
Well, that's what you were describing as the unconscious identification with the dogma, the belief in we are right and they are wrong, they are infidels and they're not worthy of life. I'm going to make a stretch. This is very speculative here, but I think part of what's going on during the virus is that evangelical Christians see the end of the world, see the end of days, and they believe they will be raptured to heaven, and they're willing for other people to die of the virus. So there's this connection between their eternal life in whatever religion and everybody else's physical death. They're like somehow intricately intertwined there.
Yeah. We saw this very much in the case of ISIS. And the problem, they wanted to bring about the apocalypse.
Yes.
ISIS attached a great deal of importance to the city of Dabiq near Aleppo, which is the place they think the prophet said that the armies of Rome, the infidel armies, will be defeated. And they believe in the coming of an anti-Messiah, analogous to the Christian Antichrist called
Yes.
Dajjal. And according to the myth, he'll be killed by Jesus in a great battle that will lead the Muslims to victory. So this is an example of the literalizing of a mythic image. The same thing happened during the United States invasion of Iraq, where a lot of the local Muslims thought this was a signal of the beginning of the end times.
Yes.
And that the Mahdi was about to arrive, who's a messianic figure who's destined to lead the Muslims to victory. You see, this is what Jung meant when he said that the more clearly the archetype is constellated, the more fascinating it is. And if you overvalue a mythic image, it leads to this kind of magical thinking. So that's why Edinger says that
Yes.
terrorism is linked to fundamentalism because of possession by these archetypal images that lead to this huge inflation.
You know, that came up for me when the Trump administration moved the capital of Israel. It was like one of the first things they did.
Yeah. If you believe that the end times are coming, then all these kind of things are seen as omens and portents. But you have to remember that the notion of the end times began to rationalize the fact that Jesus didn't come back quickly, as was initially expected. So the theology had to develop it that he would come back at some future date, which would give people time to become believers. But these are rationalizations of mythic images.
And I think that longing, yes. And in Judaism, the longing is so built in, and part of it is the longing for the Messiah's return.
Yeah, because they've suffered so much injustice that they expect that there will be a time when the books will be balanced and the people's enemies will be taken care of in a final, I mean, these are ways that people soothe and calm themselves using mythic imagery.
So Lionel, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Which is, you spoke a lot about trust.
Yeah.
And as a philosopher, I can look at the whole history of philosophy since the ancient times as two camps, one that trusts reality and one that doesn't. And what's fascinating to me about fundamentalism is there seems to be an underlying lack of trust. in the overarching structure of things, and therefore externals are relied upon. Wars are relied upon, violence is relied upon, and there is a lack of trust in the internal psychic dimension.
Yes, that's what I meant by a lack of internal structure.
Yeah, and so if we think about that, and we think about history as being sort of a partition of those who trust and those who don't, my question to you is, you spoke of early childhood trauma. Last week I was on a webinar, and the suggestion was that this stuff is genetic as well, that it's carried over the generations. In fact, there's something called post-traumatic slavery syndrome, where again, there's a genetic kind of predisposition, an awareness of oppression and how we respond to that oppression. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, this is the whole field of epigenetics, where trauma of one's ancestors is genetically transmitted, so that the trauma activates genes that would otherwise have remained dormant.
Right.
So that the children of Holocaust survivors and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors can vicariously experience something of what their forebears suffered. And this is true among, as you said, among people who've been slaves and so on. So this is well documented now.
Right. And so if we look at certain historical situations, say the Middle East, there was a period of time where the Middle East was fairly calm. But then something triggered this quality of response, this violent response. And what is it that creates that kind of triggering mechanism within the individual or within the culture?
What it's like asking what triggered 9/11.
Yeah.
A great deal of American meddling in the Middle East has been going on because, you know, they're sitting on our oil, you know. And that's led to, all that meddling has led to a great deal of resentment and built-up rage. And they have religious beliefs. They as I mentioned, bin Laden thought that non-believers shouldn't be in Muslim lands, especially Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this toxic brew of politics and religion.
Yes.
And resentment. And
it's fascinating. Pope Gregory, the 6th century Pope, was given a list of 9 things that sort of keep us away from what Connie spoke of as our yearning for transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
And he agreed to 7, which we have now sort of entombed as the 7 deadly sins. And interestingly, the 2 that he said, no, this isn't on the list, one was fear and the other was self-deception.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we think about the institution of Catholicism, or we think about any tradition, you know, that quality of self-deception, or the unwillingness to look at self-deception as an issue because of our self-deception.
Well, yeah, because we have these mental mechanisms of compartmentalization and splitting and dissociation.
Yeah.
I mean, so we can do terrible things and part of us just ignores what we're doing.
Yeah. So as Connie says, until we open ourselves up to that shadow material and to our inclination to self-deceive ourselves. And
we can't open ourselves up to it because it's too painful. That's the whole point. It's too painful to look at.
And you've been talking about fundamentalism in relation to religion. Can we talk about fundamentalism? Does it exist in relation to all other institutions?
Well, certainly in politics it exists. Yes, of course. Yeah.
But maybe on Wall Street, do we see?
I'm not sure. I have never worked with a big Wall Street type. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. Certainly, you see it in politics, and you see it in the field of psychotherapy. Because I know a lot of people who are very fundamentalist about their particular school of psychotherapy. The school that they were trained in acts as what's called a self-object for them. By belief in my theory of psychotherapy, you know, it makes me feel knowledgeable and wise and competent. And so they rigidly will adhere to a theory without looking at any other theories. So it definitely exists among psychologists.
Well, and again, the difference between Freud and Jung may be simplistic. But Jung suggests that there's a quality of reality that we can trust. And Freud seems to suggest, no, you can't trust reality.
Yes, the so-called hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
You see this line of thought, whether it's Thomas Hobbes, you know, who said that life is nasty, short, and brutish.
Yeah.
And others like Emerson, who said, no, it's a spiritual journey. It's a spiritual adventure.
Yeah.
I think what I appreciate most about this series of talks, and thank you, Dana, for doing this, is the way in which you've opened us up to the reality that this is a spiritual journey that we're all upon. There is a quality of ambiguity and uncertainty associated with it. And if we try to literalize it or concretize it, we're probably going to fall in the camp of distrusting the other. And in the process of distrusting the other, we're going to destroy our own potentials for reaching that goal of holy longing.
The longing is there, but the longing can be, you can have, like Jung thought that for Freud, sexuality was a numen, was a divinity.
Right.
So your holy longing can be diverted into other channels other than the divine itself,
Right.
which
Right.
can become God's substitutes for you.
And somewhat narcissistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. But I mean, political power becomes a God substitute, or money becomes a God substitute. Jung says whatever is the highest value in the personality is your God substitute. I think he says that somewhere. So the holy longing is once a blessing and a problem. Depends how it depends on its goal.
But again, it strikes me that after what you've shared this morning, which was so wonderful, that this is just part of the human condition. It doesn't actually find itself only in religion or in politics. It finds itself in the human psyche as sort of endemic and carried across generations, as you say, epigenetically.
Yeah.
So Will, do you have any questions, thoughts?
Yeah. You know, first of all, thank you. I've a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions. I'll be processing this for a long time. And I'm also thinking about some of the previous talks from these previous conversations when you were connecting the relationship with religion to people's relationships with other people, to parents, which can become relationships with lovers and all these types of things. So I'm also really interested in the psychology that you're presenting around fundamentalism beyond necessarily just the religious context. And I was listening to you say that a post-fundamentalist that gets out of a religion can come to hate any kind of belief system.
Yes.
And I also heard you say that the fundamentalist structures can continue and is a kind of hangover almost after you leave a particular fundamentalist perspective. So the question I have is, and I also suspect, you know, that this all applies on a cultural level as much as an individual level. So my question is it possible that we as a culture are in a post-fundamentalist, anti-religious belief, anti-belief in anything state as a culture after World War II and what came before it? And is it possible that we have become fanatical in our commitment to nihilism and deconstruction? And is it possible that we've actually come to project our hatred and our own shadow onto anybody that believes anything?
Oh, wow, well, that's a huge question. Since the Enlightenment, the role, the influence of religion has been slowly fading, and more so in Europe than in America. There's a strong fundamentalist strand in America, much more so than in Europe. But I think most of America has become secular, hasn't it, rather than religious.
Right.
But I'm not, I guess there's some research on this that I'm not familiar with. I don't know the numbers, so I don't quite know how to answer you in terms of numbers. I would have let me just use the example of the Twin Towers. You know, there's a notion that the tallest building in a culture represents the temple of that culture.
Mm-hmm.
So the trade towers were the tallest buildings. So that was the god of the culture.
Which is a god of nihilistic, put money first, where there's no complete cultural relativism that supports a commitment to greed. And that's what I'm seeing is a culture that has fallen into nihilism, which gives you nothing between yourself and greed. And so I see, and narcissism. So I see that we're in a narcissistic culture grounded in nihilism that's a reaction to belief and has become fundamental.
Yeah, well, if you give up the traditional religions, what are you left with? That's what I was trying to talk about at the beginning of this series, when we were talking about Jung's approach as an alternative to the loss of traditional religions. I think somebody else wanted to come in. I don't remember who it was.
Yeah, it occurs to me that the rise of cults of all kinds, Asian-oriented cults, Scientology, even, extreme Mormon, polygamous cults, all kinds of cults, in a way maybe rose up to compensate for what you're describing, Will. The loss of belief and the sort of epidemic of the loss of faith. And so we see these extremes.
What I really want to point out is I'm not so interested in reaction to loss of faith. What I'm interested in how the people that have lost faith have become as fundamentalist in their own way as the people who had it.
Well, I kind of look at this developmentally. There are stages of development. People who are in pre-rational stages, which is what we're talking about today, run by, the more primitive parts of the brain and so forth. People who are in rational stages, like scientists, I think are also in a way, I don't want to say brainwashed, but in possessed by a worldview and the archetypes in the worldview. And then when we go post-rational, the same thing happens. So if you look at it in stages of awareness, you might be able to see it in a little bit different frame.
Yeah, very nice comment. Rabbi Rami Shapiro suggests that it's similar to game theory, that what we have is a culture of winners and losers. It's this splitting you talked about, Lionel. And he said, paradoxically, what you have in every culture is what's called the golden rule. And the golden rule says, using game theory, that it's a win-win proposition, that we don't win unless the other wins. Martin Buber put it as I, thou. If we turn the other into a transaction or an it, objectify them, then we ourselves lose, as do they. So the paradox of fundamentalism to me suggests, yes, we believe in this golden rule. We believe in compassion, but we are going to use this word winners in a way to suggest that there are losers. And we are deeply committed to them losing, to the other losing, in order for us to win. This is the paradox to me. So Lionel, do you have any closing comments as we wrap up today?
Well, just let me make the point that all religions use this splitting defense. You're either saved and the others are not saved, or you're chosen and the others are not chosen. And if you're saved, you'll be okay. And if not, you'll go to hell. I mean, that begins very early on. I mean, it just seems to be some primitive human mechanism that we all suffer from. Would you rather be chosen or saved, by the way?
Yeah, well, and maybe not so much in Taoism or in Buddhism.
There you're just ignorant or not ignorant.
You're just ignorant or not ignorant. And, if you're ignorant, then, mercy and compassion is the only response that we can have. But in the West, the response is, okay, AK-47 or a missile. And that to me strikes me as the different ideology of Western as opposed to Eastern, where in the West, we can say truth is contained within the cover of a book, the two covers of a book. And that to me becomes a kind of nihilistic perspective, as Will was talking about earlier.
The Abrahamic traditions are all very violent. They always have been. Their sacred texts have a lot of violence in them.
Yeah.
And that's been a very damaging aspect of the Western tradition. Very unfortunate. Damaging to women, damaging to the body, damaging to the earth. They've just done a great deal of damage.
Yeah, and one of the participants has just mentioned Elie Wiesel, who again suggested that genocide and all of these things come out of this kind of splitting.
Yeah.
And unless we adopt a kind of win-win where we can see ignorance and not somebody who needs to be harmed, then it's not a problem. So again, Dana, thank you so much. I think we're coming to the end here.
I think we're pretty close. Thank you very much, Lionel, for a wonderful morning this morning, and for adding to another of the talks of Lionel Corbett. I'm touched by our own tolerance of one another to explore the inner workings of our own human psyche as a way of healing the community that is living beyond us, that ultimately transacts with the entire world and all of existence. If we're going to heal ourselves, what we really need to do is work together. We're all in this together. We're going to come out of this together. And projects like the talks of Lionel Corbett are a healing mechanism. They draw us together. Lionel, you have so much to say, and we thank you very, very much.
Thank you for arranging this, Dana.